Hello, student. Today, topic of lecture, the blood vessels system part 3. Next question. Parietal branches of the abdominal aorta, the common iliac artery, the internal and external arteries, the arteries of the lower extremities, and next question, anastomosis of the arterial system. The parietal branches of the abdominal aorta include next arteries. First arteries, arteria phrenica inferior. Arteria phrenica inferior supplies blood to the lumbar part of the diaphragm. It gives rise to small branch, arteria suprarenalis superior to the adrenal gland. This is, you see, arteria phrenica inferior. Next artery, arteria lumbalis, usually 4 on each side. Fifth artery sometimes arise from arteria sacralis mediana, corresponds to the segmental intercostal arteries of the thoracic region. They supply blood to the corresponding vertebra, the spinal cord of the muscles and skin of the small of the back and abdomen of anastomos with the inferior intercostal and the superior and inferior epigastric arteries. Arteria lumbalis. What you see, this is an arteria phrenica inferior. What you see, this is arteria lumbalis. This diaphragm. Abdominal part aorta. Next artery, arteria sacralis mediana. It descends on the anterior midline of the two lower lumbar vertebrae, sacrum and the coccyx, and terminates here as small branches of the coccygeal body. Next artery, arteria iliaca communis, dextra et sinistra. This is site of bifurcation of aorta, abdominal part of aorta, of the aorta. At the level of the fourth lumbar vertebra, the aorta divides into the right and left common iliac artery. The division occurs slightly to the left of the midline, as a result of which the right common iliac artery is 6-7 millimeter longer than the left artery. Before the sacroiliac joint, arteria iliaca communis, right and left, divides into two, into the iliaca, arteria iliaca externa dextra, and iliaca, arteria iliaca interna dextra, and left locates arteria iliaca externa sinistra, arteria iliaca interna sinistra, externa and sinistra. Arteria iliaca interna supplies the walls of the organs of the pelvis with blood. The external iliaca artery serving mainly the lower limb. Supply lower limb. The internal iliac artery, arteria iliaca interna, arises from the distal end of the common iliac artery at the level of the sacroiliac joint. This artery descends into the true pelvis and extends to the superior edge of the greatest sciatic foramen. Its divisions into parietal and visceral branches at the level of the superior edge of the greatest sciatic foramen into two main branches, the posterior trunk, which give rise to arteria iliolumbalis, sacralis lateralis, and gluteus superior, arteria gluteus superior, and the anterior trunk, from which the remaining branches of the internal iliac artery rise. Posterior trunk and anterior trunk. The parietal branches of the internal iliac artery includes next arteries. The first arteries are arteria iliolumbalis, runs behind musculus psoas major into the iliac fossa, where it forms an anastomosis with a deep circumflex iliac artery rising from the external iliac artery. Next artery, arteria sacralis lateralis, arteria sacralis lateralis, supplies blood to the levator and piriform muscles and the nerve trunks of the sacral plexus, and gives off branches, the ramus spinalis, to the foramina sacralia pelvina. It anastomosis with the median sacral artery. You see artery iliolumbalis, and arteria sacralis lateralis, iliolumbalis lateralis. Next artery, arteria glutealis superior. It runs through the foramen suprapiriformis into the gluteal region and supplies the gluteal muscles. Next artery, obturatoria, passes to the obturator foramen. It runs with nerve obturatorius to the toe. The rami pubicus extends of the posterior surface of the pubic bone and anastomosis with the ramus pubicus of the inferior epigastric artery. On leaving the obturator canal, it supplies the external obturator muscle and the adductors and give rise to the ramus acetabularis. The ramus acetabularis penetrates the hip joint through the acetabular notch and supplies the head of the femur of the and its ligament with blood. Arteria glutalis superior, arteria glutalis inferior. Arteria glutalis inferior. Next, arteria glutalis inferior This is superior and glutealis inferior. This is musculus piriformis. Arteria glutea inferior passes through the foramen infrapiriformis, with is the internal pudendal artery, arteria pudenda interna, and the sciatic nerve, and gives off a long, slender branch, the companion artery of the sciatic nerve, arteria comitans nervi ischiadici. On leaving the pelvic cavity, the inferior gluteal and other proximate muscles and anastomosing branches with which joined with the obturator, superior gluteal and medial circumflex femoral arteries. Artery pudenda interna. Pudenda interna. As you see, arteria obturator, and pudenda, artery pudenda interna. Visceral branches of the internal iliac artery are somewhat different in men and women. The arteria umbilicalis, what you see, arteria umbilicalis, retain its lumen of the adult only for small distance from its origin to the site where it gives off the superior vesical artery, arteria vesicalis superior. The remaining segment of its trunk to the umbilicus obliterates and transforms into medial umbilical ligament, ligamentum umbilicalis medialis. Next, uretic branches rami ureterice, go to the ureter. This may arise from the artery umbilicalis. Arteria vesicalis superior. What you see, obturatoria, arteria umbilicalis, arteria vesicalis superior. Arise from the unobliterated part of arteria umbilicalis and branches out of the upper part of the urinary bladder. Next artery, arteria vesicalis inferior. arteria vesicalis inferior. It runs to the urinary bladder, in men to the prostate and seminal vesicle, and sometimes gives off here arteria ductus deferens. In a woman, it also supplies the vagina, but can also be missing and is then replaced by the arteria vaginalis. What do you see? Arteria vesicalis inferior. Arteria vesicalis inferior. This is arteria vesicalis superior. This is inferior. This is superior branches. Inferior vesicalis. Arteria uterina, arteria uterina, arteria uterina, only in women before its entrance into the ligamentum laterum uteri. The artery crosses over the ureter before it branches and supplies the uterus, tuba uterina, ovary, and vagina with its respective branches. And next, arteria vaginalis, only in women. Arteria vaginalis. This is arteria vaginalis. It supplies the majority of vagina and sometimes replace the arteria vesicalis inferior. Next arteria, arteria rectalis medialis. It runs above the pelvic floor to the rectum. The vessels is rarely formed on both sides and can never be missing completely. Next, arteria pudenda interna. Arteria pudenda interna. It passes through the foramen infrapiriformis and then through the foramen ischiadicum minus into the lateral wall of the fossa ischioanalis canalis pudendus. Here it gives of the arteria rectalis inferior for the inferior anal canal, and then divides gender specifically into its superficial and deep terminal branches in order to supply the external genitalia. In men, the superficial arteria rectalis inferior, arteria rectalis inferior, supplies the intestine and gives the rami. Arteria rectalis inferior gives of the ramis cratalis posterior to the scrotum. The deep branches supply the penis with its cavernous bodies. Arteria bulbi penis, arteria dorsalis penis, arteria profunda penis. In women, the arteria rectalis inferior runs to the intestine and gives the rami labialis, posterior to the labia. The deep branches supply the clitoris with cavernosus bodies and the valval cavernosus body in the labia majora. Arteria bulbi vestibuli, arteria dorsalis clitoridis and arteria profunda clitoridis. This you see arteria glutealis superior. This is arteria glutealis inferior, and you see arteria pudenda inferior and arteria rectalis inferior, arterias rectalis inferior. This is muscles glutealis maximus. This is arteria glutealis minimus and arteria rectalis or arteria glutealis medius muscles. This is foramen suprapiriformis. This is foramen infrapiriformis. This is muscle piriformis. Next part of artery, this is the external iliac artery. What do you see? The external iliac artery, arteria iliaca externa, begins at the levels of sacroiliac joint. It stretches down and forward along the medial edge of musculus psoas to ligamentum inguinalis. When passes from under the ligament, on the femur. It is called the femoral artery, arteria femoralis. Arteria iliaca externa gives rise to two branches. The inferior epigastrica artery and deep epigastrica and deep circumflex iliac artery. Inferior epigastrica artery. This is arteria iliaca externa. Gives rise arteria epigastrica inferior. Passes medially and then upward, leads along the posterior surface of the muscles, where it branches anastomose with arteria epigastrica superior. From arteria thoracica interna. In its beginning segment, it bends around the medial edge of the deep orifice of the inguinal canal. At which point it gives off two branches. Ramus pubicus and ramus cremasterica. Pubicus cremasterica. Arteria ramus pubicus to the symphysis pubica, which anastomoses with arteria obturatoria. Arteria cremasterica, which leads to musculus cremaster and the testes. The next artery, arteria circumflexa ilium profunda. Arteria circumflexa ilium profunda. Beginning around the iliac bone, passes parallel to the inguinal ligament toward the iliac crest. Posteriorly, supply musculus transversus and the iliac muscle with blood. This is, you see, arteria epigastrica inferior gives rise arteria externa, arteria iliaca externum, and second artery, arteria circumflexa ilium profunda. Iliaca communis, arteria iliaca externa, arteria circumflexa ilium profunda. This is arteria epigastrica inferior. This is ligamentum inguinale. arteries of the lower limb, of the lower extremity. The lower extremities are supplied with blood by the arteria iliaca communis. Arteria iliaca communis. Arteria iliaca externa passes under the ligamentum inguinale and continues into arteria femoralis. What you see? Arteria femoralis. Arteria iliaca, arteria externa iliaca, arteria iliaca externa passes underneath the inguinal ligament. It continues into arteria femoralis. This changes to the dorsal side of the leg, to the hollow of the knee, where it comes the arteria poplitea. As is continuous, it is divided into artery for supplying the front side of the lower leg and the dorsum of the foot, arteria tibialis anterior and arteria artery supplying the back of the foot, arteria tibialis posterior. This is arteria femoralis divided to arteria poplitea divided to artery. Arteria tibialis anterior, arteria tibialis posterior. Arteria femoralis continues into poplitea. Arteria poplitea divides arteria tibialis anterior and arteria tibialis posterior. Arteria femoralis. Arteria femoralis begins after leaving the lacuna vasorum beneath the inguinal ligament. Here it runs between the nerve femoralis lateral and vena femoralis medial, between locates arteria femoralis. The vessels run through the adductor canal and switches to the dorsal side of the leg. Canalis adductorius. Arteria femoralis passes through canalis adductorius. Lacuna vasorum. Arteria femoralis. This is, you see, lacuna vasorum, arteria femoralis, vein femoralis. Arteria femoralis divides into 5 branches. First branch is arteria epigastrica superficialis, arteria epigastrica superficialis, arises near the very beginning of the femoral artery and passes in front of the inguinal ligament under the skin into inguinal ligament, under the skin into the region of the navel. Second artery, arteria circumflexa, ilium superficialis. Encircles the iliac bone, proceed along the inguinal ligament to skin of the region of spina iliaca, anterior superior. Next branches, arteria pudenda externa, run medially and supplies the external genitalia. Next, arteria profunda femoris. Arteria profunda femoris is the main vessel through which vascularization of the femur is accomplished. It's a thick trunk which originates from the posterior side of the femoral 4 or 5 centimeters below the inguinal ligament, lying first behind the femoral artery, when appearing from the lateral side and giving off numerous branches, rapidly diminishing in caliber. The arteria profunda femoris supplies the toe, both front and back. The branches of arteria profunda femoris. This is first arteria circumflexa femoris medialis, arteria circumflexa femoris medialis. It runs medial and posterior and continues to divide it into rami ascendens to the anterior part of adductor and rami profundus rami acetabula e acetabula. Ramis profundus runs to the posterior portion of the adductor, the ischiocrural muscles and femoral head. Rami acetabula passes to the hip joint, connects to the rami acetabularis of the arteria obturatoria and the ligamentum capitis femoris to the femoral head. What you see, arteria profunda femoris. Arteria circumflexa femoris lateralis. It runs laterally under the musculus rectus femoris and has the following branches: rami ascendens, proximally to the gluteal muscles and femoral neck, anastomosis with arteria circumflexa femoris medialis and arteria glutealis superior et inferior, rami transversus laterally to musculus vastus lateralis, rami descendens to the musculus quadriceps femoris. rami perforantes. It right angles to the course of the arteria profunda femoris. They penetrate the adductor muscles and ischio-crural muscles, supply this and femoral shaft. Artery perforans prima, arteria perforantes, many arterias perforantes. In approximately 20%, the arteria circumflexa femoris, medialis and lateralis each originate from the artery femoralis. They form arterial ring around the neck of the femur and supply this and large parts of the femoral head. This is, you see, arteria circumflexa femoris medialis, circumflexa femoris lateralis, and gives off rami ascendens, transversus, descendens. Rami acetobularis. This creates an anastomosis network made up of branches of the arteria iliaca interna, arteria glutea superior and inferior, and branches of the profunda femoris, arteria circumflexa femoris radialis. And you see ligamentum inguinalis, femoral artery, arteria femoralis. This is arteria perforantes. You see arteria femoralis profundus. This is arteria circumflexa femoralis lateralis. Next artery, arteria poplitea. Arteria poplitea with the exit from adductor canal in hiatus adductorius. The arteria femoralis extend to the arteria poplitea. This transverses the whole of the knee, fossa poplitea, until it divides at the level of the tibial condylus tibialis, into arteria tibialis anterior and posterior. What you see, arteria tibialis posterior. It gives up another 6 branches and forms a vessel's network with the anterior to the knee joint reta articulare genus. Forms next arteries. Arteria superior part, arteria superior medialis and lateralis genus. Medialis, arteria superior medialis genus, arteria superior lateralis genus. Around the media and lateral femoral condyle. То есть around condylus medialis, around condylus lateralis, condyle. And next, arteria media genus, arteria media genus to the knee joint. Media genus. Arteria inferior medialis and arteria lateralis genus. Arteria inferior medialis genus. Arteria inferior lateralis genus. Around the proximal tibia, the head on the fibula. And arteria suralis, to the calf muscles. What you see, arteria poplitea, this is poplitea. This is arteria tibialis posterior. This is 22 with arteria tibialis posterior, 21 arteria tibialis anterior, posterior, anterior. Arteria poplitea divides two arteries, arteria tibialis posterior and arteria tibialis anterior. This is branches, medial muscular branches from poplitea, muscular branches, rami muscularis. This is, you see, lateral superior genicular artery. This is artery genicular superior medialis. Arteria tibialis anterior. Penetrates the membrana interossea cruris and runs along. This is in extensor compartment distally. It is a compound accompanied by nerve fibularis profundus. It forms arteria dorsalis pedis, arteria dorsalis pedis at the level of the ankle joint. At the lower leg, the arteria tibialis anterior divides into 4 branches. Arteria recurrens tibialis, arteria recurrens tibialis anterior and posterior. Run before and after the passage through the membrana interossea back to the knee joint. Arteria malleolaris anterior medialis and lateralis. You see arteria malleolaris anterior, this lateralis, and medialis. To the vascular network on the inner and outer ankle. Arteria dorsalis pedis. It continues the direction of the arteria tibialis anterior to the medial side of the dorsum of the foot and divides into total of branch. Arteria tarsalis medialis, arteria tarsalis lateralis, arteria tarsalis medialis. This artery to the medial and lateral margin of the foot. Next, artery arcuate, arteria arcuata. It arches over the basis of the metatarsal bones and divides into artery metatarsalis, which are involved in supplying the tooth via arteria digitalis dorsalis. Arteria plantaris profunda, penetrates the first interphalangeal space and anastomoses with arteria with the arcus plantaris profundus. Of the sole of the foot. Arteria arcuata, arterias metatarsalis dorsalis, arterias digitalis dorsalis. Dorsal surface of the foot. Arteria tibialis posterior. Arteria tibialis posterior continues the course of the arteria poplitea. Arteria tibialis posterior accompanies the nerve tibialis, nerves tibialis, between the deep and superficial calf muscles distally behind the inner ankle, which it supplies with rami malleolaris medialis and divides into rami calcanea. To the medial side of the heel. It runs through the neurovascular passageway of malleolar canal towards the sole foot. The main branches is the arteria fibularis, branches of arteria tibialis posterior, arteria fibularis, or arteria peronea. Arteria fibularis. It runs along behind the fibula parallel to the arteria tibialis posterior distally and divides into rami malleolaris lateralis to the external ankle and rami calcanea to the lateral side of the heel. Rami calcaneo from the artery tibialis posterior, rami calcaneo lateral. It is branches of arteria fibularis. Arteria plantaris medialis. On the sole of the foot, the arteria tibialis posterior is divided into two terminal branches. Arteria plantaris medialis. It runs medial to the musculus flexor digitorum brevis and connects to the arcus plantaris profundus. Arcus plantaris profundus. Arteria plantaris lateralis. It runs underneath the musculus flexor digitorum brevis and form arcus plantaris profundus. The deep arch, a superficial arch is not usually formed, is located below the basis of the ossi metatarsi and divides into arteria metatarsalis plantaris with the arteria digitalis plantaris communis and the arteria digitalis plantaris propria. They supply the underside of the tooth. This is metatarsalis. This is arteria digitalis plantaris communis, metatarsalis. This is digitalis. This is arteria digitalis plantaris propria. Arteria plantaris medialis, arteria plantaris lateralis. What you see, this is arteria poplitea, arteria tibialis posterior, arteria peronealis, fibularis artery, arteria fibularis. Fibularis. Arteria tibialis, anterior, this is posterior. This is, you see, knee. The anastomosis of the arteries provide evidence of unity of the arterial system. Anastomosis between branches of the major arteries, aorta, carotid arteries, subclavian and iliac arteries, and other. That function as independent vascular system are called intersystemic anastomosis. Anastomosis between branches of the single large arterial trunk within the limits of the artery are called intrasystemic anastomosis. For example, you see table which consists anastomosis, the artery, the system of the artery subclavia. You see next some table. What see you see? This is anastomosis of artery, the system of subclavia. Anastomosis of the brachial girdle of three upper limb arteries, and anastomosis of arteries of the thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic cavities, and anastomosis the arteries of the pelvic and the arteries of the lower limb. It is information about anastomosis. This information for you. For next lesson of the anatomy. Note, for example, anastomosis, you must information about anastomosis of the arteries system, the system of subclavia and other arteries. Arteries which found anastomosis, for example, between artery subclavia and arteria carotis externa. This is branches of arteries which found anastomosis. This, for example, arteria thyroidea inferior, arteria thyroidea superior. Arteria thyroidea inferior from truncus thyrocervicalis. Arteria thyroidea superior from arteria carotis externa. This is anastomosis located the thyroidea gland. Next, for example, next anastomosis arteria subclavia and carotis interna. Arteria carotis interna. Between arteria cerebri posterior from arteria basilaris and arteria communicans posterior from arteria carotis externa. Location, the base of the brain. It is short information about anastomosis. This information for you. Follow the anastomosis of arterial system. Anastomosis of the brachial girdle and three upper limb arteries. This is short information about anastomosis. This is arteries, anastomosis of the arteries of the thoracic, abdominal, pelvic cavities. Next table, anastomosis, the arteries of the pelvic and arteries of the lower limb. My lecture is finished. Today, goodbye, student.